This is a call for an uprising. Welcome to today's show. Charles Manson, dead today at the age of 83. I've talked about him a bunch on this channel. I've also talked a lot about the CIA, MK Ultra, mind control experiments, social experiments that have been done on the masses through MK Ultra, specifically with assassins who are trained through the CIA to destroy social movements or to create social movements. Charles Manson, just like Jim Jones in Jonestown during the hippie movement, had ties to the Central Intelligence Agencies, as most of these people do, and I'll get into that shortly. But Charles Manson, dead at the age of 83, the wild-eyed 1960s cult leader whose followers committed heinous murders that terrorized Los Angeles and shocked the nation, died Sunday of natural causes, according to the California Department of Corrections. Goes on to say that the charismatic Manson orchestrated a wave of violence in August 1969 that took the lives of 7 people, spawned headlines worldwide, and landed him and his Manson family of followers in prison for most of the remainder of their lives. Manson served 9 life terms in California prisons, was denied parole 12 times. His notoriety, boosted by popular books and films, made him a cult figure to those fascinated by his dark apocalyptic visions. Now remember, most of these serial killers are glorified for a reason. That is because the hand behind the puppets who are involved in these things are usually the elites very high up. That's why you hear about all these cult leaders. That's why Charles Manson has been glorified. He hasn't been looked at as a serial killer as much as he's been looked at as some type of figure of a movement in the 60s. People have been fascinated with him because the media has made people fascinated with him. You'll see his posters. They sell his posters at the mall. This is a guy who is directly linked to satanic murders. Now, I talked about Katy Perry buying the house where the Tate murders occurred. Obviously, the female Tate who was killed was the wife of pedophile Roman Polanski, who at the time was making the film Rosemary's Baby. Polanski, again, another guy walking free who was involved in pedophilia that nobody seems to care much about, that he's free on the streets. The brutal killings began August 9th, 1969 at the home of Sharon Tate and her husband, Roman Polanski, who was out of the country at the time. The first set of victims were Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, a celebrity hairstylist named Jay Sebring, Coffee Fortune Harris, Abigail Folger, another writer, and Stephen Parent, a friend of the family's caretaker. The next evening, another set of murders took place. Supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were killed at their home. Rosemary, again, a connection to Rosemary's Baby. Although Manson ordered the killings, he did not participate. This is the narrative that they've been giving people for a long, long time, that he had the control to brainwash these people in his cult into performing these mass killings, where there is truth to that, because Manson was a handler of the people involved. Manson has direct ties to Central Intelligence, just like Jim Jones did, where Jim Jones in Jonestown, which again I'm going to be covering, is looked at as, wow, this guy got all these people to go down to another country and live this utopian lifestyle. Then he got them all to kill themselves and drink the Kool-Aid. That is because these people were handlers working as CIA operatives, but pretending to be these cult-like leaders. All of this stuff done under the guise of MK Ultra programming. In '69, the Manson family was subject of sensational news reports and eventually found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Now, people believe that the reason behind it was to create this massive movement at the time, because we were going through the hippie movement, everything that was going on with boycotting the Vietnam War and the war efforts. The CIA was attempting to end this, to turn the hippie movement into something scary, a huge distraction from what was going on in Vietnam. There are connections between whistleblower Charles August Sholland, or Chuck Sholland, who is a whistleblower who has blown many cases open, who suggested that the murders were a covert operation which was carried out by Central Intelligence. He came across the Don Bowles papers during the 70s, which, amongst other things, gave information on the CIA's involvement in the Manson family murders. Sholland actually filed a lawsuit against George W. Bush Sr. for unlawful attempts upon his person to suppress this information, though it never went to trial. Just like anything involving George Bush, nothing will ever go to trial. Scholin claimed that the CIA's prime objective at the time was to debunk the hippie movement. He said the war was going badly and the American people were protesting in even greater numbers with pictures of pretty flower girls on TV nightly protesting. The CIA needed a way of showing the American people that these pretty little flower girls were really evil and that the government was right and just in the war. To do this, the government needed to conduct a massive covert operation to convince the American people that these flower girls were evil and free love and peace they talked about was really to cover up evil. Scholin suggested that Manson was in fact a social experiment and the CIA had not only been supplying drugs to the Manson family but also funding their living. Now remember, the hippie movement was all about experimental drugs, LSD and all this stuff. They were pulling people off the streets and offering them LSD, offering them all types of drugs, and people were fine with going under these MK Ultra experiments, not even realizing what they were doing. A lot of this was done at Vacaville prison, okay? And obviously MK Ultra is one of their most famous projects, and Manson was in the prison at the time that they were known to be using inmates in this prison at Vacaville for MK Ultra experiments. This is before the murders occurred. So he was in prison, at this prison where the CIA regularly was experimenting with drugs on the prisoners. And then this all went down where they suddenly were living, in the house that they claimed that they were living in and living this hippie movement of love and peace, all this Helter Skelter stuff. Even in the book Helter Skelter, Manson's prosecutor talked in depth of Manson's mind control abilities. So pretty much what I believe personally happened, and many people believe, is that he was experimented on and put under MK Ultra to be a handler. These people that he brought in, he used the same mind control tactics that the military and the government used on him. He was trained to do this. He created this cult through using LSD and the mind control tactics that the CIA taught him and that the military uses. He was convincing them that he was almost like a god to them. They fell under his handle, and the next thing you know, these murders were carried out. Gary Webb, who's a journalist, also exposed the CIA for their drug dealings. Listen, we know that these murders really do happen, and that there are isolated incidences where murders do happen, but most of the time, in instances like this, when it's glorified years and years later, such as, like I talked about, Gacy, John Wayne Gacy, still talked about. Dahmer, still talked about. Manson, still talked about, still glorified. Okay? There's a reason that they're still glorified, because they had their hand behind it. It created fear, it created panic, it created a distraction, and it ended up changing the viewpoint that people had on this hippie movement, which was peace, love, dope, right? Peace, love, happiness. Meanwhile, all of these people who were following along in this movement didn't even realize that they were under a massive social experiment, just like what happened in Jonestown. So they're saying that his death was natural. I already heard some people saying that it was a satanic. I mean, sometimes you got to wonder where some of these people come from. I know there's a lot of people who are desperate for clicks and views, but there's some people out there who already have videos saying that it was an Illuminati sacrifice. He was 83 years old, for crying out loud. Okay? If he was going to leak any information or do anything, they would have whacked him a long, long time ago. In fact, there's people that don't even think that, I've heard some crazy conspiracies where people think he's actually George Bush Jr. and stuff like that, which are pretty far stretched, but people are entitled to their own opinions. But people really do die, in this world. So 83 years old. And again, talking about the Don Bowles papers, there's physical evidence of Operation Northwood, which shows the CIA's proposal to the Kennedy administration to commit acts of terror on U.S. citizens in an attempt to blame Cuba to justify a war. So there's a lot of things that the CIA had their hand in to make sure that we kept and stayed in the Vietnam War. And the uprising that was going on then, the hippie movement, which was really, people who wanted to see the war end, they didn't want to see it end at the time. And this was the huge distraction that they created at the time to get that movement disbanded, in a sense, because it was a social experiment that was going on. Now, listen, everybody's entitled to believe what they want on these things. There's some people that believe he was just some crazy loon who convinced all these people who followed him to commit these crimes. But you have to remember, mind control, when these cult leaders use mind control, they're usually government operatives because they know how to perform mind control on their victims. They aren't just going around going, hey, will you do this for me? And, I really love you. Can you kill somebody for me? I mean, if you asked your best friend to kill somebody, you think he's going to go do it? Highly likely he wouldn't, right? Unless he was a government operative who knew how to mix these drugs, use tactics to create trauma-based mind control, to create alters and splits where they can trigger these people into committing these crimes and doing these things, and then they don't even remember doing it. So these cult leaders like Manson, like Jones, they're all around the same time period as well, all a part of CIA, handling. They have their hand in everything. When you see connections to it, whether it's the Don Bowles papers with this, and Chuck Schuld's, attempt to prosecute George W. Bush for having his hand involved in this and his hand involved in these mind control experiments and nothing ever happening. It's the same story that we always hear. So Charles Manson dead at the age of 83. I'm sure everybody out there is really going to miss him. But remember, a lot of these stories that come out that continue to get glorified 50, 60 years later, there's a reason for it. It's usually that the CIA has more than just their hand in it, are behind the entire operation. And there's always a reason for the operation, whether it's to end a social, to change the mindset of people, to create this social experiment, to distract people from what's going on, or to persuade them into, going along with the agenda that they want. So Manson dead at the age of 83. I thank you for listening to today's show. God bless all of you and your families.